People doing an ordinary thing on what should have been an ordinary day. Around the world, citizens suffer the consequences, both big and small, of decisions they do not make, of global trends they can't control. They should find reassurance from their leaders. They should be able to look to the people in this room for action, for real solutions. But increasingly, people are losing faith that their leaders and institutions can protect them and support them in a rapidly changing world. De plus en plus, les citoyens doutent des bienfaits de notre monde intégré. Ils pensent que la mondialisation profite seulement à ceux qui sont déjà riches. Ils se sentent interpellés par les mouvements populistes qui exploitent leurs inquiétudes et prônent l'isolement. Le résultat, c'est de plus en plus de pays qui se replient à l'intérieur de leurs frontières. We live in a world in which more leaders are challenging long-standing principles of international relations. Protectionism is on the rise. Trade is being weaponized. The benefits of democratic governance are being questioned. Basic freedoms are being suppressed, and authoritarian leaders are being emboldened. Political anxieties are adding turbulence to a world that is already facing unprecedented change. The global balance of power is shifting, with new powers rapidly rising and others becoming more assertive in their regions. Climate change is an existential threat to humanity, with science telling us we have just over a decade to find solutions for our planet. And while the breakneck pace of technological change has created new opportunities for people everywhere, it also poses new challenges for governance. When I think about these issues and the impact they're having on people, I ask myself what Canada can do. Canada is an influential nation, but I won't pretend it's big enough to move the dial on world affairs on its own. But in this connected world, where our economies are linked, where our destinies are tied, I know that retreating within our borders will not make our people safer or our nations more prosperous. In my time as Prime Minister, I've seen firsthand how forums like this one and international cooperation can make a real difference in people's lives. The solutions we build at meetings like these can mitigate tensions, address inequality, create new opportunities, and solve shared challenges. But the fact remains that for far too many people, multilateralism has not been delivering the kind of change they seek. While we should not abandon these long-standing principles of international cooperation, we must recognize the need to reform and modernize our institutions. Some aspects of the international architecture reflect old ideas and old power structures. Institutions that should play complementary roles instead overlap or operate alone in silos. We need to address that. At the same time, it's not enough to apply old solutions to new problems. Today, we are confronting issues that defy established forms of global governance. We have to look beyond existing frameworks to deliver real results for citizens. We have to bring together old friends, new partners, the private sector, and civil society to address emerging problems. That means that we can't always wait for the perfect consensus to be reached within the bounds of established bodies. Delivering results requires us to take action with those who are ready to move. Working with partners, Canada has been applying this pragmatic approach in a number of areas, most notably on trade, on advancing democracy, and on fighting climate change. The progress we've made has reinforced my belief in the power of collaboration and the promise of our institutions. And that's why Canada will continue to step up at a time when others may be stepping away. take trade. In the last 4 years, Canada has renegotiated NAFTA, signed the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, and joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are the first and only G7 country to have a free trade deal with every other G7 country. But had we chosen to ignore the very real concerns of people across the political spectrum on free trade and globalization, we might not have preferential access to 2/3 of the global economy today. We made the conscious decision to address those concerns directly in 3 major global trade agreements with landmark standards to protect the environment, labor, human rights, gender equality, indigenous rights, and our culture. Mais cette vision du commerce international est seulement possible si les échanges sont encadrés par des règles et des principes. C'est pourquoi le Canada a lancé une nouvelle initiative à ce chapitre, le groupe d'Ottawa. Le but, c'est d'aider à moderniser l'Organisation mondiale du commerce de façon à faciliter les échanges et améliorer le règlement des différends. En même temps, le Canada et l'Union européenne travaillent ensemble pour établir un nouveau mécanisme d'appel qui permettra de poursuivre l'arbitrage des différends commerciaux en attendant des réformes à l'OMC. Il y a quelques semaines, 15 autres pays ont appuyé cette démarche. Il reste évidemment du travail à faire, mais c'est un bon exemple de la contribution positive que le Canada cherche à apporter au reste du monde. At the turn of this new decade, we're facing big, inescapable challenges, and many of them strike at the core of our democratic principles. The values we hold dear are coming under threat, and our commitment to uphold them is being tested. Journalists are being jailed. Free speech is being restricted, and calls for democracy are being suppressed. That's why we worked with the United Kingdom to establish a global pledge on media freedom. And with France and 33 other countries, we're supporting the Declaration on Information and Democracy, which commits countries to protect freedom of opinion and expression around the world. Nous ne pouvons pas oublier que ce sont les hommes, les femmes et les enfants innocents qui subissent les conséquences dévastatrices de l'inefficacité de la communauté internationale. Le conflit en Syrie et la situation tragique à Idlib en sont de parfaits exemples. Nous ne pouvons pas fermer les yeux sur les échecs du multilatéralisme, nous devons plutôt en tirer des leçons. Without constructive international engagement, prolonged local crises harm vulnerable people and expand into regional emergencies with global implications. That's why Canada has worked more closely than ever with our Latin American allies as part of the Lima Group to defend democracy in Venezuela. That's also why we remain committed to supporting peace and stability in Iraq, particularly through our leadership of the NATO mission there. Together, as a community of nations, we're making progress. Progress that simply would not have been achieved had we decided to take on these challenges on our own. And the threat of climate change is perhaps the best example of why we must continue to choose collaboration. It is the defining issue of our time. It will reshape our societies and the global economy. And above all, it threatens not only our way of life, but our very existence. When I joined the other world leaders in signing the Paris Agreement, I pledged that Canada would do its part to meet this challenge. More than 4 years later, I stand before you more determined than ever to be a full partner in the international fight against climate change. Ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, I will continue to be a champion for a price on pollution, both at home and abroad, because a world where it is no longer free to pollute anywhere is a world ready to defeat the climate crisis and seize the opportunities of a new era. Soyons clairs, Je ne cite pas ces exemples parce que je crois que le Canada est le seul pays à apporter une contribution positive à notre monde. Au contraire, si nous avons réalisé des progrès, c'est justement parce que nous avons pu compter sur des partenaires qui, eux aussi, sont pragmatiques par rapport aux défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés. Des partenaires qui, eux aussi, sont prêts à agir. You know, on Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752, people of 6 different nationalities with ties to many more countries were on board. This is the interconnected world in which we live. There is great promise in that world. A place where we benefit from the free exchange of ideas, where differences enrich us instead of weaken us, where our connections across borders make our communities a better and more resilient place to call home. That is a world worth fighting for. When I first heard about the tragedy, one of the very first people I called was my friend, Prime Minister Mark Rutte. The Netherlands, along with 10 other countries, was struck by a tragedy all too similar 6 years ago when Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down. While the loss of life is heartbreaking, the fact that this could happen more than once is appalling. So we must take action. Working with partners and building on the important work of the Netherlands following the downing of Flight MH17, we're developing a Safer Skies initiative. By changing how countries work and share information together, we can improve aviation safety over and near conflict zones and prevent tragedies from happening again. Millions of people board a plane every day, and they shouldn't have to wonder whether they could become inadvertent targets. This is just an example of something that, as leaders, we can do together, and only together, to make our world safer. But it shouldn't take tragedies for leaders and governments to act. Just like it shouldn't take dire warnings of scientists or devastating wildfires for us to act on climate change. These forums bring together people who not only share challenges, but the power to act on them. For multilateralism to work, people have to be able to count on us to take on the problems, both big and small, that they cannot solve on their own. Canada is ready to partner with old friends and new allies to do just that, and I know you are too. So let's show the people we serve that we hear them and that we will work together because they deserve no less from all of us. Vielen Dank. Merci beaucoup. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Can I now invite Prime Minister Solberg and Chancellor Kurz to join us on the platform? So thank you for a wonderful speech, which once again reminded me, Prime Minister, that Canada would be a perfect member state of the EU. Liberal, bilingual, multinationalist, internationalist. Perhaps you'd like to take the UK's place.
I hear you have an opening.
Very good. Now, if you, ladies and gentlemen, if you chart on a graph mention of the words Western Alliance since 1945, what you get is the shape of a Bactrian camel. So it starts nowhere, goes right the way up to a peak in the mid-1960s, then comes way down again over the hump, Watergate, Vietnam, convergence in Europe, goes right back up again to the peak of 1989, and then from that point onwards just goes steadily down, 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 almost back to the point we were in 1945. And the question before us is, why has there been this dramatic decline in the salience of the notion of the West, of the Western Alliance? Is it because interests have diverged. So one could say quite simply, we had a common enemy in the Soviet Union that kept us all together until 1989. Now, with China and Russia, it's a different story. If you look at the ECFR opinion poll in the MSC report, staggering majorities in most European countries say in the event of a conflict between the US and China or the US and Russia, they would remain neutral. Very different story from during the Cold War. Or is it because our values have diverged both across the Atlantic and in different European countries? Or is it simply because the West is less relevant in, to put it in crude shorthand, a post-Western world? Or is it some of all three? So I want to kick off with a question to Prime Minister Solberg and then to Chancellor Kurz, which is, what in your view, very briefly, is the heart of the problem, and what should we do about it so that that camel, which currently has its head in the sand, gets its head out of the sand?
Well, I think I don't really agree with you. If you want to look at what people do in this world, where do they move? Where do they want to go? Which ideas and societies do they want to live under? If you look at migration waves, illegal and legal, they drift towards the West. So I wouldn't be that pessimistic. It's not just about wealth, but it's also about ideas, freedom, and I think we just have to uphold it even higher. So even if our ideas, because countries and systems are changing and you have more economic power in more autocratic societies than you had earlier on, if you really look at the movement of people, they drift towards the countries with Western values still. Our question is how we manage to uphold those Western values in our societies, how we make sure that our societies is inclusive, how do we make sure that people feel that they can move upwards in our society, have a social development in our society. And of course there are economic powers and technological powers that is changing around the world. I still think that if you really look at those who move, they move towards our ideals still.
So if I may follow up on that, because I think the relationship between values and interests is absolutely crucial in this. Now, you had a particularly challenging example of this when the Nobel Peace Prize was quite rightly awarded to Liu Xiaobo, a truly heroic figure, and someone who shows that the values we like to think of as Western values are not just ours in the West, they're shared by people across the world. The Chinese reaction was very strong, and it hit you quite hard, your salmon and other aspects of your economy. My understanding is that you've managed somehow to recover that relationship. Tell us a little how you managed that really difficult balancing act between standing up for the Western values and yet pursuing the national interest.
Well, first of all, it took 6 years without any diplomatic relations between Norway and China until we decided and we found out it was time to become friends again and had a good discussion on these issues. And we are back into a more normal position today. I think there is a difficulty in explaining how a committee is independent in our countries. It's not part of foreign policy or governmental policy who gets the Nobel Prize. To be honest, sometimes we as politicians get a bit angry on who gets the Nobel Prize too. We do smile, we always do because we are polite, but of course we know that we are getting trouble with it, or maybe we think that we would have thought differently. But I mean, we are an independent democratic country with an independent Nobel Committee who does their decisions based on principles. And talking about that to the Chinese was difficult, I have to admit. But also because they don't understand our system that way. But we managed to work ourselves together. And what really happened was that there were very little political contacts. There were a lot of commercial activity between Norway and China at that time. We had technology, interesting businesses that worked in China, where the Chinese were interested in having their activity in China. But we had some problems with consumer market goods, which would basically benefit us and the Chinese consumer, but not, their build-up of the society. But so we had a slower progress in our economic cooperation with China than other European countries had. But for a country like Norway, who believes in multilateralism, who believes that we should talk to everybody, that we should have to work together in the international community, it's always so difficult not to be able to speak to the second largest economy in the world, the biggest country when it comes to people, which of course is a political difficulty. But we are back on track, and maybe sometimes problems solves itself on the way. It just takes some time.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't understand German, the Chancellor will be speaking German, so reach for your headphones. Herr Bundeskanzler, was ist für Sie das Kern des Problems der Krise des Westens und was machen wir damit?
Also ich weiß gar nicht, ob es eine große Krise des Westens gibt, aber ich habe Ihre Frage zu Beginn sehr interessant gefunden. Wie kann es sein, dass vielleicht der Blick in der Gesellschaft sich verändert hat? Und ich glaube, wenn wir in der Geschichte zurückblicken, dann war wesentlich klarer, welches Modell ist erfolgreich. In Deutschland war sehr schnell klar, wie die Lebensbedingungen im Westen sind und wie sie im Vergleich dazu in der DDR sind. Wir in Österreich, uns war allen klar, es ist gut, auf der westlichen Seite zu leben und nicht die Entwicklung einiger Oststaaten durchmachen zu müssen. Ich glaube, heute ist die Nachrichtenlage in den Medien für die Bevölkerung wesentlich vielfältiger. Wenn die Menschen hören, wo gibt es das größte Wirtschaftswachstum der Welt, dann spielt sich das nicht in Europa oder in den USA ab, sondern in anderen Staaten im Osten. Wenn wir anschauen, wo gibt es die größten Innovationen, den größten technischen Fortschritt, dann ist das nicht mehr so klassisch verteilt, wie es mal war zwischen West und Ost, sondern da ist die Welt einfach eine wesentlich vielfältigere geworden. Und gleichzeitig erleben wir in den letzten Jahren mehr und mehr Spannungen innerhalb der Europäischen Union und mehr Spannungen zwischen der Europäischen Union und den USA. Und insofern, glaube ich, kann unser Zugang nur sein, dass wir versuchen, schleunigst wieder das Verbindende vor das Trennende zu stellen im Westen, dass wir uns schleunigst wieder bewusst sein sollten, dass das, was uns eint, wesentlich mehr ist als das, was uns trennt, und dass wir nur erfolgreich sein können, wenn wir zusammenarbeiten, die westlichen Staaten untereinander, aber natürlich auch im Dialog mit allen anderen. Je erfolgreicher wir sind, auch wirtschaftlich, desto größer wird, glaube ich, auch in anderen Teilen der Welt der Drang danach sein, es uns gleich zu tun. Und ich glaube, was die Premierministerin vollkommen zu Recht gesagt hat, das, wofür wir stehen, die Ideale, Demokratie, das Volk, das souverän ist, Rechtsstaatlichkeit, dass alle Menschen nicht nur an Würde, sondern auch an ihren Rechten gleich sind, das ist etwas, was nach wie vor hochpopulär ist und was nach wie vor eigentlich auf der Welt erstrebenswert scheinen sollte. Und insofern, glaube ich, ist unsere Verantwortung, diese Werte auch in die Welt zu tragen. Und je stärker diese Grundwerte auch mit wirtschaftlichem Erfolg, mit Wohlstand verbunden sind, desto mehr Menschen weltweit werden auch versuchen, diese Gesellschaftsmodelle, diese Staatssysteme auch zu kopieren und zu übernehmen.
But isn't part of the problem here that if people feel that these values are not being fully respected at home, inside Europe, then we become less credible in preaching these values abroad? If I may pick on a particular case, a country which is very close to you because until the First World War it was Austria-Hungary, namely Hungary. In Hungary we've seen in the last few years a really significant erosion of the rule of law, of liberal democracy, of an independent civil society, of everything we would understand under Western values. Shouldn't we do something about that first if we're to be credible preaching these values to the rest of the world?
Also die Zeiten der österreichisch-ungarischen Monarchie sind lang vorbei, insofern können wir nicht für Ungarn sprechen, aber Ungarn ist nach wie vor ein Nachbarland und insofern gibt es natürlich sozusagen ein starkes Bewusstsein in Österreich, was in Ungarn und anderen Staaten stattfindet. Und ich glaube, Sie haben vollkommen recht. Bei Rechtsstaatlichkeit, bei Demokratie, bei Fragen der Medien- und Meinungsfreiheit darf es keine Kompromisse innerhalb der Europäischen Union geben. Es darf zu jedem Thema unterschiedliche Meinungen geben. Es braucht eine vitale Diskussion in der Europäischen Union, aber Rechtsstaat, Demokratie, Meinungsfreiheit, Medienfreiheit, das sind Grundwerte, die nicht verhandelbar sind. Ich würde nur vorsichtig damit sein, dass wir uns allzu sehr schlecht machen. Ich erlebe in Österreich zum Beispiel, dass es eine ausgeprägte Diskussion über die Frage der Rechtsstaatlichkeit in Ungarn und in Polen gibt, dass es tagtäglich Kritik an den USA gibt, aber dass es weite Teile der Welt gibt, wo Demokratie ein Fremdwort ist, das wird in der Diskussion wesentlich seltener erwähnt. Und insofern würde ich Ihnen recht geben, streben wir danach, dass wir unsere Ideale im Westen zu 100% leben und geben wir uns auch nicht damit zufrieden, wenn sie irgendwo nicht zu 100% gelebt werden. Aber machen wir im Umkehrschluss bitte nicht den Fehler, dass wir nur auf die Defizite in der EU und in den USA sehen und vergessen, dass wir im Vergleich zu vielen anderen Ländern dieser Welt schon noch einzigartige Privilegien genießen. Demokratie, Rechtsstaatlichkeit in der Art und Weise, wie es das in den USA und in Europa gibt, ist in weiten Teilen der Welt einfach nicht vorstellbar. Und ich glaube, wo Sie recht haben, ist, das Bestreben, hier keine Kompromisse einzugehen, ist richtig, aber gleichzeitig auch mit mehr Selbstbewusstsein, mit mehr Selbstvertrauen international aufzutreten, uns auch nicht immer nur selbst schlecht zu machen. Das würde ich für ganz, ganz wesentlich erachten im Wettstreit der Lebensmodelle weltweit. Denn wenn wir unsere Lebensmodelle nicht mehr proaktiv positiv verkaufen, wie können sie dann irgendwo anders jemals kopiert werden sollen?
But just to be absolutely clear, you do think that the EU should do more to try and ensure that there is respect for rule of law in all member states?
Ja, selbstverständlich. Ich glaube nur, wir sollten sehr stark unterscheiden zwischen diesen Grundwerten, die nicht verhandelbar sind, und anderen Diskussionen, die es auf europäischer Ebene immer wieder gibt. Was mir nicht gefallen hat in den letzten Jahren, war, dass ich das Gefühl hatte, dass die osteuropäischen Staaten auch in anderen Fragen der Meinung waren, sie sind Mitglieder zweiter Klasse. Dass ein Stück weit die Idee der Europäischen Union in Vielfalt geeint verloren gegangen ist und es manchmal ein bisschen den Eindruck gemacht hat, als wäre das Ziel, in Gleichheit getrennt zu sein. Ich glaube, es gibt Bereiche, die haben Sie angesprochen, die sind nicht verhandelbar. Aber in allen anderen Fragen sind unterschiedliche Meinungen zulässig. Von der Migrations- bis zur Klimapolitik ist es gut, wenn es eine Debatte gibt. Und da hat jedes Land in der Europäischen Union Sitz und Stimme. Und es sollte keine Mitglieder erster und zweiter Klasse geben. Wenn wir hier unvorsichtig sind und das Gefühl einer moralischen Überlegenheit Einzelner entsteht, oder manche das Gefühl bekommen, sie sind nur die zweite oder die dritte Klasse in der Europäischen Union, dann ist es gefährlich, die Gräben werden tiefer werden und die Einheit wird bröckeln beginnen. Und das wäre ganz schlecht für die EU, aber auch für den Westen in Summe.
I do agree on that, and a symptom of what you're talking about is the fact that people are now talking all the time about Eastern Europe rather than talking about Central Europe, as we did 20 or 30 years ago. I want to open it up to the public in a minute, but I did just want to come back to Prime Minister Trudeau on, this seems to be a key question of the relationship between values and interests. So it's not just in Europe that we have problems occasionally with governments who don't seem to have quite the same idea of what Western values should be as we do. We have a president of the United States whose idea of Western values might be slightly different from your own. How have you managed that tension, that balance between staunchness in defending liberal values, Western values as you understand them, and the enormous interests of Canada in a good relationship with the United States?
I was elected by Canadians to stand up for Canadian interests, to speak up for Canadian values, and to work with whomever gets elected around the world as best I can. And that has been my focus. That is why we work on a constructive relationship with the United States. We engage, the United States, more than a constructive relationship with the United States. They're our closest neighbor, closest trading partner, and we share deep history and values together. Doesn't mean we're going to agree on anything. If any one of our countries only agreed to speak to people who agreed with us, it would be a very lonely world. And I think what you do is you have to know who you are, know what you stand for, and engage in the world, understanding that you're going to have to make compromises, but making sure that it is very clear where your values are. I will take a little bit of an issue with the sort of conflation we have of the West and Western values and the universal values we tend to aspire to. I think within any grouping of countries that you can choose to make, there are going to be countries that do things a certain way or perhaps a little further along in the dotted lines of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights than others. But to look at it as the West and the rest, to sort of reflect that perhaps the challenge we're in right now is the West is losing ground because the East or the South is rising, I don't think is an honest portrait of what we're actually looking at as a world. I just came here straight to Munich from a trip in Africa where I was in Senegal and in Ethiopia. And I can tell you that their commitment to democracy, their commitment to values, even though there are definite challenges around LGBT in Senegal and around other issues in Ethiopia, they want to aspire to these values and to creating prosperity and opportunity and growth and human rights, and they're doing a great job of it for the most part, not because they remember with fondness the colonial powers that had influence over them decades ago and centuries ago, but because they see that this is the right path forward. Sure. And the frame that says that, that our way is the right frame, and yes, every now and then we slip off of it in certain areas and we should get back towards it, and everyone else should, of course, come towards it as well, is not respecting one of the core values of Westernness, which I think is a fundamental respect for diversity. And if we're going to respect diversity, meaning diversity of backgrounds, of religion, of language, of skin color, and see them as a source of resilience and opportunity, well, we have to also recognize that diversity within approaches to governance, approaches to finding modern articulations of social norms and histories means that perhaps the Western model isn't the only model that matters in the world. I think that's something we can all understand. But how you articulate that is by genuine engagement. And Canada is very, very lucky. I mean, when we're in a room like this, people just, oh yeah, Canada, it's practically Europe. It's an extension of the North Atlantic Alliance. We're the ones between the U.S. and Europe, both geographically, if you're flying over the pole, and other ways. But Canada has had the experience of being so much more. We are deeply engaged with the South, straight south of us in the Americas. We're also a Pacific nation, and engaging in genuine terms on their own terms. With countries of Asia in a way that doesn't weaken our own grasp of what are Canadian values, which are different than German values or French values, not tremendously, but always subtly, is a sense of knowing who we are and being confident in engaging with people and not afraid to be approached with different perspectives.
What's the key difference between Canadian and German values?
Oh, I'm not going to go there. I think, actually, I had a wonderful event this morning where we were talking about the challenges of migration, talking about things that Canada can learn from Germany as well as the other way around. I mean, there are a lot of the same challenges we're facing in the world because we are pluralistic, open, rule-based societies in the world. And it's always easy, especially if you're journalists, to look at, well, what's different? Where do you disagree on this? Where's the hook I can write a good story on? But when you get down to it, the things that unite us, the things we want for our families, for our kids, for our communities, are so much more similar than the things which differentiate us one from another.
I mean, I think this is a very important point, which is actually partly because the shrinking relative power of the West, we almost condemn, but also actually normatively should think of the future of the West as being to go beyond the West. And that means looking to other civilizations to see what in their own value system is actually similar or at least compatible with ours. And if you take the subject of free speech, for example, actually India, for example, has a fantastic tradition of thinking about free speech, going back far beyond ours, in fact. So that's a good example where one can find it in other civilizations. I think the Prime Minister wanted to come in briefly, and then I'll throw it open.
You asked what was the difference between German and Canadian values, but I think what we have to to understand is that our political systems and the way we interpret our values into politics and into representation, into legitimacy for our governments is different also in the Western societies. I mean, we have different election systems, we have different basic conflicts, and when we look at other countries trying to adapt to and not adapting to all of the values we have, not managing the same way, we also have to understand that our democracy is based on our historic different involvement of our societies, and that's the conflicts, that's the party lines depends on this. So maybe we should be more in focus on the individual rights, the legitimacy, and not just about how it is, how far ahead can other countries go. But for me, the basic thing is, it's difficult to not have some kind of testing of your right to run a country. You need to have some kind of democratic challenge, you have to have some kind of approval of that, and you have to have your standards on minorities, respecting, I mean, democracy, rule of law is also about respecting minorities' rights, and that the majority doesn't always decide.
Sure. Very quickly, if you
Just one short point, because your first question, I think, was the West more attractive in the past? And I think there's one point we should be honest to all of us that has changed in the last decades. In the past, of course, the Prime Minister was right, the West was always attractive because of democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, and I think we still are. But in the past, democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech always was hand in hand with economic success, with growth, with wealth.
Absolutely.
And now we live in a time where other systems can be economically successful as well. And I think this is something that changed the whole game. And if we look at China, for example, they are able to build a hospital in 10 days. In Europe, we would have a debate about 10 days when to have the first meeting to discuss it. And then it would take years to decide, and then it would probably take years to build it. In the end, maybe the quality would be better, but in days like this, it's not all about quality. So I think what has changed is that we now know that other systems can be economically successful as well, and that means that we have a lot of pressure to stay successful, because I think there will be not a lot of people in the world who would like to copy our systems if they see that we are not economically successful and that we cannot keep our growth, our wealth, and the quality of living in our system.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There is an alternative modernity, something we didn't think was the case in the 1990s, and now there is again, and as you say in German, Konkurrenz belebt das Geschäft, so it's maybe good for us. Now, one thing all our democracies believe in is that the people should be allowed to speak. Please identify yourself, a few short sentences ending in a question mark, and say to whom that question is directed. The first one is going to a Munich young leader over here. Could we have a microphone, please? And then I'll take something over here if someone would like to, right at the back there. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm a Munich Young Leader 2020, and thank you, Ambassador Ischinger and Munich Young Leaders Program for strengthening and supporting women voices on peace and security issues. I'm Ketevan Chumbadze, Deputy Political Director of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, the country which 30 years after the fall of Berlin Wall is still divided and by barbed wire fences and face actually the challenges of illegal occupation. The country which face grave humanitarian crisis because of closure of the occupation line and human rights violation in the occupied territories. Chancellor Kurz 2 years ago visited the occupation line and situation the local population is facing. I would like to focus and ask my question to distinguished panelists about the West and Western values and the notion of Westlessness, which is more probably also about how we defend the values and rules-based international system, not only at home, but also abroad. And this is what makes Europe attractive. So my question would be, what and how do you see the Europe at peace and secure Europe, and how to address the challenges of unresolved conflict in eastern part and eastern flank of Europe, because at the end of the day, this is about defending our values as Europe as a whole.
Thank you very much. I'm going to group a few questions. There was someone at the back there.
From the Centre for European Reform in London. A question for Mr. Kurz. The EU is currently discussing how to work out its finances for the next 7 years, the so-called multi-annual financial framework. There's discussion whether the provision of EU structural funds should be tied to respect for the rule of law or not. Are you in favour of tying EU structural funds to respect for the rule of law? And if you don't think that's a good idea, what other mechanisms should the EU use to make countries that disregard the rule of law comply with the rule of law?
And we'll take one more here.
I represent Silicon Valley in the United States Congress. I want to thank you, Prime Minister Trudeau, for your brilliant point of a distinction between what is West and what is universal. I was born in Philadelphia in 1976, and yet my grandfather spent years in jail with Gandhi, so I don't know if I'm a product of the West or a product of the East. But I would love your reflections on how nations can become multicultural, multiracial democracies and what you've done on that.
Thank you very much. A specific question to Chancellor Kurz from Charles Grant.
Also zu der Frage nach den Verhandlungen zum EU-Budget. Ich glaube, es werden in Summe sehr intensive Verhandlungen
Die Verbindung zur Rechtsstaatlichkeit, ja.
Genau, es werden in Summe sehr intensive Verhandlungen werden, nicht nur über die Höhe des EU-Budgets und über die Schwerpunktsetzung, sondern natürlich auch die Frage, soll es eine Verbindung zwischen Rechtsstaatlichkeit und Budgetmitteln aus Brüssel geben. Wir als Österreich unterstützen diese Idee, auch in der Gruppe der Nettozahler, in der wir gut abgestimmt sind, mit Mark Rutte und anderen gibt es Unterstützung für diese Idee. Wir werden sie in die Verhandlungen einbringen und hoffentlich auch die Chance haben, sie am Ende des Tages durchzusetzen.
Prime Minister Trudeau, there was a specific question to you.
A quick reflection. We are a country that was created by immigration from every corner of the world, where we learned to succeed through their long, cold winters by indigenous people who'd lived there for millennia. So from the very beginning, what was a Canadian was a composite of many different identities. At the core of Canada was the English and the French, who'd been warring in Europe for centuries, and we ended up creating a country that identified that duality, and from that point, not without setbacks and terrible moments of intolerism and racism in our past, still deep challenges that remain in reconciling with Indigenous peoples, but we got to a place where we don't define ourselves by a cultural or linguistic or religious or ethnic identity. We've come to define ourselves as a modern pluralistic society based on shared public values. Values articulated in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, values of openness, respect, compassion for each other, willingness to work hard, a desire to be there for each other, an understanding that an economy isn't a zero-sum game. Someone doesn't have to win in order for someone else to lose, or vice versa. And we have realized that defining ourselves as an identity not around singular external assets or attributes that you can't aspire to if you show up with the wrong skin color, is actually an incredible source of strength. If you imagine for a second you're trying to put together a tiger team to respond to some intractable problem in your organization. Well, if you fill that entire team with one gender, with one group of people who've gone to the same types of schools, the same socioeconomic backgrounds, the same neighborhoods in the towns they grew up in, you're unlikely to get particularly creative solutions out of that group. But if instead you choose gender balance, you choose people from different intersectionalities, different layers of experience, different corners of the world, different approaches to a problem, you are not going to be just better at solving the problems. The problems you solve are more likely to resonate better with a larger group of people who you're responsible to serving. Diversity is a force of strength, but it is challenging because it forces each and every one of us, if we're truly listening to someone who is other, to question whether or not we are right in our core beliefs. If we don't open ourselves up to being perhaps convinced by someone who is different than us, then we're not actually engaged in true dialogue. And the learning how to open yourself to others is at the core, and God, we're far from perfect on it, and no country is. But we are working to define ourselves through our values and not through geography or ethnicity. And that, I think, with the migrations we're facing in the world, with the reality of globalization, is the way the world is going in the 21st century. So we've all got to get a lot better at it.
Prime Minister Solberg, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, because I think there's a very big difference between US and Canada, who are immigrant countries, and countries like Norway and probably Austria and others who have, people have been living there for tens and thousands of years. But I think we have the same core. The same core is that if you believe in your Western ideas, you should believe that everybody is equal, that you don't have any special rights because your parents have been living here forever. Like my whole family comes from the countryside outside my hometown, Bergen, and can run back at least to the 12th or 13th century or something. We don't have other rights than people who are living. It's by the things that you contribute to your society that is the most important part of what you're doing. But it's a challenge, and you're in the middle of identity politics, because just to tell a story, we have an uproar in the Scandinavian countries now because the Scandinavian airline system, SAS, just had a commercial saying that nothing is really Scandinavian, that we have imported everything to be open and others. And I got 60,000 right-wingers on the social media saying they will never fly SAS anymore because they are ruining the Scandinavian identity or our history. And that's the middle of the debate that we are standing every day, I think, is to acknowledge that the ideas we have on the individual's contribution to the society, our openness, what we call the Western values we have in our value system, to really practice it when people are coming with different cultures, different background, and being integrated into our society. And it's difficult for everybody when you're doing it.
Chancellor.
I think there's a similar approach on diversity, but one thing is different. I think that Canada has extremely good rules who is allowed to come to Canada. These rules are extremely strict, and I would say Canada is something like a very exclusive club. So you can't really compare it to other systems and other countries in the world. We in Austria have a very high number of immigrants coming to our country. We had a high number of immigrants during the last 30 or 40 years. But the people who are allowed to come to Canada are mainly very well skilled, and they also have to have language skills. And I think this is the difference to many other systems. We in Austria, we don't have problems to integrate the son and the daughters of the ambassadors who work at the United Nations in Vienna. There are no problems with them. But of course, if you have many people from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, who are not very well skilled and have no chance in the Austrian labor market, it's much more difficult to integrate them. And so I would say that the main difference and the main question is who is allowed to come, and what kind of migration do you have as a country?
So I think there's a real difference of nuance there.
It's
sorry.
more than a nuance, but it is a real difference. I absolutely agree. But if you look at Canadian history, whether it was accepting in Vietnamese boat people, whether it was accepting in Syrian refugees, 40,000 of them after they, in the end of 2015, beginning of 2016. And you go look at those families, no, they didn't have much in the way of language skills. They didn't have much in the way of any investments to bring to it. But they and everyone who comes to any country has a deep desire to succeed and work hard and build a better future for their kids than they had back home. And yes, I recognize that the scale and the numbers involved in what came to Europe, what has come to Germany particularly, has been tremendous and represents real challenges. And on the flip side, when Canada, over the past couple of years, has had a few hundred people coming in over the borders a day or a week irregularly, there were real debates in Canada about our borders are too porous, we can't handle these numbers. The issue and the difference isn't in the skills of the people coming, although a points-based system is one that has allowed us to stay positive around immigration, and Canadians are supportive of immigration, and we bring in over 1% of our population every single year in immigrants. But the difference is in how you include them, how you give them tools to integrate. Even if they didn't come from a wealthy family with a great education, they have a tremendous amount to contribute. And the strength of your social safety net, the strength of the investments you're willing to make in those first few years will pay off 1,000-fold over a generation. And that's what Canada has understood, and that's what a lot of countries have understood.
But you would accept, Prime Minister, that
Yes, the accident of geography that has us protected by two oceans in the United States, I absolutely grant that as well.
Yes, blessed by geography. Chancellor.
I totally agree in the goal. I think the point I just wanted to make is the numbers are important. If the US takes less refugees in 1 year than a small country like Austria, there's a difference. So what I just wanted to point out is it's not only important how many people come, you have to distinguish how many of them are very well-skilled migrants and how many are refugees. And if you compare the numbers, in many years, we as a very small country have much higher numbers of refugees than bigger countries like Canada. And on qualified migration, you are on top, but these people are a bit easier to integrate. That's just
and another example of the Western Centre, we can't even have this conversation without reflecting on Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and others who've accepted millions of refugees and are doing an extraordinary job, and we need to help them more.
Now, can I just, Chancellor, follow up? We have a digital agora coming at me through this iPad, and there's a question which in a sense follows on this. The question comes from somebody in Denmark, and it is Sebastian Kurz and Social Democratic Mette Frederiksen in Denmark have beaten the right-wing populists. Are they models for the new European liberal democratic leadership? So that's the question. But I could also put the question the other way, which is, we are experiencing a kind of political earthquake in Germany at the moment because of just a touch of collaboration between the established democratic parties and a right-wing xenophobic populist nationalist party, the AfD. You were in coalition for 2 years with the Freedom Party in Austria, which, if not exactly the AfD, is certainly a right-wing populist xenophobic nationalist party. So do you think the right way to go about it is to get in bed with the populists, or what would you say to the critic who said that actually destroys the foundation of shared Western values that we're trying to defend?
Also ich glaube, dass unterschiedliche Staaten bei allen Ähnlichkeiten und Anlässen zur Vergleichbarkeit doch dann immer wieder unterschiedlich sind. Wir haben in Europa ganz viele verschiedene Systeme. Wir haben Länder, in denen mit absoluter Mehrheit regiert wird. Wir haben ein präsidiales System in Frankreich und wir haben Systeme, die vielleicht leichter zu vergleichen sind. Ich glaube, Österreich und Deutschland haben durchaus politisch sehr vergleichbare Systeme. Zwischen der AfD und der FPÖ, würde ich sagen, gibt es durchaus Unterschiede. Und insofern halte ich den Zugang der CDU im Umgang mit der AfD für richtig. Ich halte es für sinnvoll, dass das Parteipräsidium klar entschieden hat, es darf keine Zusammenarbeit mit der AfD geben. Und ich hoffe, dass es jetzt auch für Thüringen am Ende des Schlamassels doch noch irgendwie einen positiven Ausgang gibt. Dass ich als Vertreter der Volkspartei, wir sind die Schwesterpartei der CDU, mir wünsche, dass bei der nächsten Wahl die CDU gut abschneidet und auch wieder in Zukunft die Regierung in Deutschland anführt, das ist klar. Ich traue mich nicht vorhersagen, welche Koalitionsform das werden wird. Was wir in Österreich erlebt haben, ist, dass die frühere große Koalition, die wir immer hatten, also eine Kooperation aus Sozialdemokratie und Volkspartei, dass die am Ende alles andere als gut funktioniert hat, dass die eher zu Stillstand und zu gegenseitigem Streit und Blockade geführt hat. Und insofern haben wir versucht, aus dieser Regierungsform auszubrechen. Zuerst, wie Sie richtig gesagt haben, in einer Koalition mit der Freiheitlichen Partei, jetzt in einer Koalition mit den Grünen. Und wenn ich raten müsste, würde ich sagen, nach der nächsten deutschen Bundestagswahl gibt es vielleicht auch eine ähnliche Konstellation in Deutschland, aber das werden die Wählerinnen und Wähler hier entscheiden.
Sehr wahrscheinlich. Wir sitzen ja in einem Land, das seit langem eine große Koalition hat. Das wissen wir alle. Okay, I'm going to take a final quick round of questions. If you could be very brief and sharp, and then we'll have a chance for a final round of answers. There was somebody over here. Can we have a mic quickly to this gentleman there, please? And then I think I saw a hand over here. Yeah, right at the back there, by the stairs. And a mic to hand. And one right at the very back, in front of the camera. Keep your hand up, Edward. Yep.
Thank you very much, Michael Gala, European Parliament. As we are approaching the final round and would like to come back to the topic that we had, should we be pessimistic about the prospects of our value system and our attractiveness, where it was referred to that some autocratic or authoritarian states are able to build a bit quicker. Indeed, yes, but I think if we have the full picture at this very moment, at this very thing, I think in the very moment where people see, wow, 10 days to build a hospital, yes, but ahead of that, what happened? The whistleblower who discovered the whole thing was reprimanded and silenced. Instead of starting fighting the disease earlier, he was, as I said, reprimanded, and then the whole thing broke out further. And I think if that is the price, to have a very quick hospital, but ahead of that, to silence the whistleblower, I don't think it is as attractive as it might seem at first glance. So I think we should be quite optimistic about the ways and means that we are addressing problems that come up in our societies. And I think that is also attractive for other countries further ashore. And we see it, I think, also what the Hong Kongers are longing for. That is not the model that is prevailing in Beijing.
Thank you very much for that comment, even if it didn't have a question mark at the end. The lady at the back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Sana Mandolini. I'm the founder of the International Civil Society Action Network and the LSE. Thank you for your point about pluralism. I'm a fusion identity, Iranian, American, Italian, British. And I think that what we do is we weave the very best of all the cultures we have, and we don't mind pointing out the worst of all those cultures. And I think it's important to have those conversations. And to that point, at the moment, when we talk about Westlessness, number one, we can't talk about Westlessness without talking about the weapons trade that is fueling the many wars that then bring the refugees to the shores of Europe. So that's one thing. And secondly, the moderator mentioned India as an example of a country where freedom of speech has a history. That's true historically, but at the moment, what is happening in India should be a warning sign to all of us. And I'm just wondering what the panel has to say around our Western, the values, universal values, but what do we do when we have a country like India basically creating statelessness for its Muslim population? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last question at the back.
Edward Lucas from SEPA. My question's about solidarity. Prime Minister Trudeau, you stood up against the Saudis and nobody much supported you. Now you're being whacked by the Chinese with the two Michaels in cruel detention for, I think, more than 2 years now. don't you feel a bit disappointed by the lack of support you've had as you experience the blast of Chinese disapproval? The Prime Minister of Norway, you've experienced this. Now your next-door neighbours, the Swedes, for some reason are being picked on by the Chinese for daring to give a literary prize to a Swedish guy who's jailed in China. Might this not be a time for the Norwegians to come to the help of your beloved next-door neighbours and show some solidarity? And Prime Minister Kurz, Austria is neutral. Does that mean you never take unpopular stances in defence of anybody?
Thank you very much, Edward. We'll go in reverse order. Chancellor Kurz.
Ich beginne vielleicht mit der letzten Frage zu unserer Neutralität. Ja, es stimmt, wir sind ein neutrales Land, das ist Teil unserer Identität und das wird auch so bleiben. Ich glaube aber, dass insbesondere auch neutrale Länder einen überproportionalen Beitrag leisten können. Wenn es zum Beispiel um Friedensmissionen geht, wir haben über 1000 österreichische Soldaten im Einsatz in friedenserhaltenden Missionen vom Kosovo bis zum Libanon und insofern, glaube ich, können wir da einen Beitrag leisten. Es braucht auch Orte für Dialog, wo Österreich und die Schweiz immer wieder versucht haben, einen Beitrag zu leisten. Und zum Dritten würde ich sagen, die Werte des Westens zu verteidigen, das ist nicht nur eine militärische Frage, sondern auch etwas, wo man in anderen Bereichen einen Beitrag leisten kann. Aber ich gebe zu, ich bin durchaus auch der Meinung, dass es immer wieder Krisenherde gibt, wo eine militärische Intervention notwendig ist, wo wir keinen Beitrag leisten können und auch leisten werden, aber wo wir durchaus auch zumindest verbal mutig genug sein sollten, anzuerkennen, wenn andere da eine Aufgabe übernehmen, die eben irgendjemand übernehmen muss. Wenn ich darf, auch gleich zur ersten Frage im Vergleich zu China. Vollkommen richtig, dass wir zufrieden und vor allem dankbar sein sollten, in dem System leben zu dürfen, in dem wir leben dürfen. Ich war einige Jahre Außenminister und je mehr man unterwegs ist, desto dankbarer wird man. Und insofern, glaube ich, wäre es einmal angebracht, dass wir versuchen, unser eigenes System nicht schlecht zu reden, dass wir dankbar für das sind, was wir haben, aber gleichzeitig auch ständig den Blick darauf richten, wo wir besser werden können. Einerseits, weil sich unsere Gesellschaften verdienen und ich glaube, gerade die Frage der Entscheidungsgeschwindigkeit, gerade die Frage der Wettbewerbsfähigkeit, gerade die Frage, sind wir auch beim technologischen Fortschritt vorne dabei oder fallen wir zurück, die müssen wir als Europa ansprechen, wenn wir nicht an Lebensqualität verlieren wollen. Und ich glaube, wir haben da nicht nur eine Verantwortung unserer eigenen Gesellschaft gegenüber, sondern ich bleibe bei meiner These vom Beginn, wenn wir an Wettbewerbsfähigkeit, an Entscheidungsgeschwindigkeit, an Wohlstand, an Lebensqualität verlieren, dann werden andere nicht so demokratische Systeme im Wettbewerb der Systeme für Menschen attraktiver werden. Und das wäre wahnsinnig gefährlich. Wenn ich als Außenminister unterwegs war und für Rechtsstaatlichkeit, Demokratie und Meinungsfreiheit geworben habe, war das immer ein leichtes, weil die Menschen auch aufgesehen haben zu unserem wirtschaftlichen Erfolg, zu unserer Lebensqualität, zu der Art und Weise, wie wir auch finanziell als Bevölkerung leben dürfen. Und ich möchte mir nicht ausmalen, wie es wäre, wenn wir unsere Werte anpreisen und verteidigen, aber dazu sagen, aber es ist halt das weniger erfolgreiche System und vielleicht die wirtschaftliche Lebensqualität, die ist eine schlechtere als anderswo. Das wäre, glaube ich, eine gefährliche Entwicklung, die ich nicht erleben möchte.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister Solberg.
Well, first of all, we do support the Swedes. And we have also addressed this towards the Chinese, and we will continue to do that. I think it's important that we are standing up for our values in meeting with other countries, but there are different ways of doing it. We also have a bilateral discussion of issues where we also do every year discuss human rights with the Chinese to make sure that we point out where we think we have problems and where we are seeing it. So I think it's a good way of organizing a discussion around this. And then we do something in Saudi Arabia, which I would just hope that more countries are doing, because my ambassador says that there are fewer and fewer of those ambassadors who always participates in court cases against human rights activists in Saudi. and there's been fewer and fewer Western embassies that are represented. We continue to do that because then we are there, they know it's reported, they know it's seen, and I think it's important that we are continuing to do that type of work. That's actually the way that you can also continue to work on our ideals and and to make sure that you are putting a pressure on other countries who are breaking what we say fundamental human rights in their behavior. And I think it's extremely important that we are following this. Third thing, just to answer on, is everything gloom? Well, I believe we are in this situation where we've had very high activity on globalization since the Berlin Wall fell and the Chinese entered market economy. Globalization has been going very fast forward. We are stepping some steps back, but we will go forward again because technology and the movement of people will lead this world to become more and more global. And what we will need in the future is more global governance. It's about climate change. It's about making sure that we take care of our ocean. We need to make more global governance, and people will feel it. If you go around the world, people are now talking about plastic in the oceans because they can see it. They didn't do that 10 years ago, but I see it's a mutual problem, and people will take care more of what's happening in their surroundings, and we will need more global governance to do that. So I'm not as gloomy as some of you are, because I think if you're going to go 20 years ahead, we will have more global governance and more international agenda setting again. And I think we will see that this was a phase that we are going through because the movement is still there.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Trudeau. Can we sustain this note of optimism?
I think we can, because even though, yes, it is a serious and significant problem that we have 2 Canadians who we feel have been arbitrarily detained in China for political reasons, the international community, even though it hasn't come out guns blazing and loudly about it, has been extremely supportive in bringing up this issue with the Chinese in conversations. And that's where solidarity, because people are aware that this is something that could affect any one of us. I had early on in this situation a great conversation with Erna where she talked about the experience they'd gone through with the Nobel Prize and the challenges. And it just takes a lot of consistent work in making sure that there is a demonstration of firmness and a desire to find solutions and an echoing of those concerns around the international community. But at the same time as, yes, we are having challenges with China in this recent coronavirus challenge and issue, Canada has been there to send medical supplies to China, to be supportive, to work with them and the WHO to try and help where we can in resolving this. So just because you have a serious disagreement on an issue that may be extremely important to you and to Canadians, it can't prevent you from continuing to talk and try to solve other things at the same time. There are far too many aspects to global relationships to not try and engage in a constructive way.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've had a very substantial conversation, actually got to the heart of the matter, the relation between values and interests, freedom and diversity, liberalism and pluralism, the Western and the universal. These really are the issues at the heart of this conversation. And please join me in thanking our 3 speakers very much. Sehr gut. Vielen Dank.